Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on cybersecurity. I can see that attendee numbers are moving up, so let's get cracking. From a Pennington's Manches Cooper perspective, we've been talking to our clients about cybersecurity for quite a long time now, focusing largely on the legal aspects, which we can directly get involved with. But cybersecurity, of course, presents technical as well as legal challenges. And so we're very pleased today to bring together expertise on both sides to share latest insights. So a quick introduction to the speakers. This is who you'll be hearing from this morning. Firstly, on the PMC side, you'll be hearing from me, Oliver Kidd, a partner in the IP, IT and commercial team, specializing in contractual matters with a particular focus on technology. Also from PMC, Charlotte Hill, a senior associate in our commercial disputes team, also focusing on the tech sector and digital assets in particular. And last but by no means least, Gavin Russell. He is the CEO of WaveX Technology. WaveX is one of the leading IT companies in London, delivering award-winning IT managed services for over 20 years, and we're delighted to be collaborating with them on cybersecurity resilience programs for a range of organizations. A quick look at the agenda for today's session. We'll be beginning with looking at why cybersecurity is important. I will then be taking a look at a typical cybersecurity threat cycle. Gavin will take over and delve into latest technology and trends. Back to me for legal landscape and a few developments in the legal landscape that are coming down the track. Over to Charlotte for responding to attacks, criminal issues, and then we'll all be chipping in on the preventative measures which organizations can take. We will then be mentioning a new audit tool, which we've been working with WaveX on, details on that later. And hopefully there will be a bit of time for a Q&A at the end. So as we're going through, if you do have any questions, please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box and we will pick up as many as we can at the end. But before we launch into the substance of today's session, we'd like to get a quick sense of the levels of cyber resilience in the room, the virtual room that is. So we have a question here, fairly straightforward question. How do you rate your current IT cybersecurity maturity? And these range from 1, what is cybersecurity, all the way through to 5, which is fully documented policies and procedures, cybersecurity schedules in all of your supplier contracts, appropriate technology in place, cyber insurance in place, and regularly tested response plans. So hopefully that poll's been launched. And we'll give it a few more seconds. And we did run a similar session last year, and most responses were around the 2 to 3 mark. So it would be interesting to see where we are now. Okay, great. So it looks like we've moved up slightly in terms of cybersecurity maturity of the people attending today. A fairly good spread with some encouraging stats around 4. So we'll bear that in mind as we go through. So having done the poll, why do we actually need to consider cybersecurity and why is it important? Well, there are a range of very compelling reasons, really. And this list here is just something that the three of us have come up with, really, and there will be other reasons that that you can add to that list as well. But principally, from the legal perspective, cybersecurity is needed in order to comply with legal obligations and avoid regulatory action, for example, fines from the ICO and other authorities, which we'll be looking into a bit further later. Also, to ensure contract compliance and avoid contractual claims. For example, if your organization suffers a cyber attack leading to a loss of confidential information, then that is likely to constitute a breach of the confidentiality clause of the relevant contracts. Also, good governance from a data and staff security perspective, also to protect key assets. For example, an IP-heavy industry organization which has as its key assets IP, it's vitally important that those assets are protected, and cybersecurity is needed to ensure that they are. Also, the ability to obtain and claim on insurance policies. Also, cybersecurity is coming up increasingly in a due diligence context. This could be that customers are carrying out audits of their supply chain, but also in terms of the work that we get involved in, it could be raising capital, M&A. Any potential investors or acquirers will be carrying out thorough DD on their target to ensure that they are proceeding with a worthwhile corporate event. Similarly, company valuations. Organizations that take cybersecurity seriously are more likely to realize a higher valuation and resale price if that is their intention. Credibility and reputation. We see that organizations that take cybersecurity seriously are able to harness that customer confidence. And this isn't just consumers, but also corporate customers. Customers are more willing to engage suppliers that have good cyber resilience already in place. And it could be that customers are looking for certain cybersecurity accreditation, such as ISO 27001. Yeah, I think it really does add to credibility and reputation. And finally, director fiduciary duties around duty of care. And that's something that Charlotte will be looking at later. So there are many good reasons to strive for greater cyber resilience, but what are the stages to focus on? Well, because the threat of cyber attacks is ever present, we find it's helpful to consider each stage as part of a cycle. So we've depicted this here in a slide and broken down the key stages. So if your organization is under attack, the first stage you'll be looking at is response. So you'll be responding to the cyber attacks with immediate crisis response. There could be ransomware demands, managing investigations by regulators, business continuity, reputation management, and Charlotte in particular will be looking at tactics around responding to cyber attack to mitigate the damage that is caused. After the immediate response, then you'll be into the remediation phase. How can you get your business back up and running? And there will be various strategies around whether you can make any claims, pursue any bad actors, and carry out ongoing data health checks. And the bit that I'm most interested in is prevention and detection. I think we will mention it a few times today, but prevention really is better than cure. So rather than be pulling together your crisis response, in response to an attack, now is the time to be taking those steps and putting those measures in place, which would stand you in good stead if and when you do come under attack. So on that, we will be talking about cybersecurity's policies and procedures, training, insurance, and we'll come into those mitigation steps a little later. So we're conscious that a business with competing demands and limited budget might struggle for buy-in internally on cybersecurity. So we thought it might be helpful to look at some stats to perhaps focus the mind and justify the focus in this area. In our mind, it really is a case of when, not if, a cyber attack will happen. And I think some of these stats back that up. So the main stats in this area are the ones released by the government, the Cybersecurity Breaches Survey 2022, and this found that 39% of UK businesses suffered a cyber security breach or attack during the past 12 months. In terms of frequency, a quarter of those reporting are attacked at least weekly. The most common form of attack is phishing, amounting to 83%. And in terms of the consequences, 1 in 5 reports losing money, data, or other assets. So those stats are from last year. We're obviously expecting more this year, and we expect those figures to be even higher. As well as the stats released by the government, we've also looked at various industry and sector focus reports, and the one that I've picked out here concluded that amongst those organisations surveyed, there has been an increase in awareness and concern around cybersecurity, but 83% of those respondents reported as not being ready. The report also concluded that downtime as a result of a cyber incident now stood at around 19 days. So think about that in terms of a business interruption as a result of a typical outage, and that is a fairly decent amount of time. Also, even just this year in the UK, looking at the news, there have been several high-profile targets. The ones I picked out here are the Royal Mail, JD Sports, and Arnold Clark, and each of those resulted in stolen customer data and downtime, and they all led to adverse media attention, which is obviously a key focus for cybersecurity. And I finally mentioned here opportunistic phishing. You may remember around the response to the COVID-19 outbreak, there were several NHS test and trace scams where scammers were using that as a platform to attack vulnerable victims. And even yesterday, I was looking in the news that people looking to book accommodation in Liverpool for the Eurovision Song Contest, they were receiving phishing emails from scammers purporting to be accommodation providers in Liverpool. So I think we always have to be aware that whenever there is an opportunity, the scammers will try their luck. So the threat of a cyber attack is a very real threat to businesses, and it's one which is increasing. I think that's in part due to widespread working from home, but also the increased sophistication of attackers. Although it's not possible to completely eliminate the risk of an attack, there are steps which can be taken to minimize those risks. And I'll bring Gavin in now to talk about the latest technology that's out there.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. Thank you very much, Ollie. And those of you wondering what this silly thing is on my shoulder, it's an arm sling from a pulled shoulder on my first day of skiing, would you believe? So it's quite frustrating. Right, so regarding IT, there's obviously quite a lot that can be done, but to try and help explain those different areas, most of the solutions and the services fall into sort of 5 discrete areas. So what we have is prevention. And if you look under there, hopefully there's technologies that you're quite familiar with, things like firewalls, antivirus, anti-spam, multi-factor authentication. These are all critical solutions, and hopefully they prevent most of the sort of potential cyber attackers gaining access to your important information. However, and unfortunately, they do not prevent everything. And as Ollie mentioned, there's some quite well-read news stories about where hackers have bypassed these mechanisms. So you therefore need methods to detect a cyber attack. Now, detection tends to fall into two categories. You've got solutions that will tell you a cyber attack is underway. So, excuse me, they're more reactive solutions, but all the more important though, and also proactive solutions. And that's things like vulnerability management. When I say proactivity, what they tend to do is focus more on the risks. So you're not necessarily being hacked, but because you understand your risks, you can do something about it. So hopefully avoiding a hacker coming along and exploiting that risk. Terribly sorry about my cold. And then should an attack occur, and as Ollie said, it tends to be a case of when, not if, then you need to have something in place to help you remediate and resolve those. Now, all of you will have some sort of IT solution, whether that's an internal IT team, whether you outsource it, or you've gone for a specialist security provider, which is often referred to as a SOC. These organizations will help jump on any IT issues that occur. But there's lots of new technology that's also appearing to help organizations stay on top of cybersecurity. So three of the newer technologies are these. So you've got endpoint detection and response, EDR, and that's where instead of simply jumping on a threat, you actually are looking at a lot of other information that's available on a endpoint, like a laptop. So that helps triangulate exactly what's going on. But because cyber attacks now are not as simple as just targeting a single machine, they tend to build up. So someone is trying to get into your Office 365 account, and then they get into your Office 365 account, and from there they get sensitive information that allows them to get access to another site. So an attack can actually be across the organization. So then you've got technologies called XDR, which is pulling in data from a lot of different devices and trying to correlate it together to try and build up a full picture of exactly what has happened. Now, obviously, systems like this generate a lot of data, so organizations often struggle putting the right numbers of people on these technologies to manage them. And this is where MDR comes in. And MDR is a managed service. So you get all the benefits of that, but with the people as well. But understandably, it's also the more expensive one as well. So they're some of the newest technologies within cybersecurity. Now, obviously, once a cyber attack has occurred, then it's all about how do you get things up and running again. And this is where your recovery solutions step in. Again, there should be some very familiar technologies here. Backups is the most obvious one. So it's absolutely critical that you know you have everything backed up, not just your data, but often your systems, server restore points, because you want to get back up and running as quickly as possible. Obviously, if you've just backed up your data and you have in-house servers or even cloud servers, it's still going to take time to rebuild those. So it's important that everything is backed up across the organization. And finally, but equally importantly, is reporting and assessments. So it's still quite a surprise to me how many organizations don't really know their level of security. You know, they have no real visibility into understanding what their security posture is, and tend to operate on the assumption that, well, we've got firewalls, we've got antiviruses, we haven't been hacked, so things should be okay. And often it's only after they've been hacked do they start investing in these systems. So some classic ones that you might well have at the moment actually is Microsoft Secure Score. So if you use Microsoft's Office 365 platform, you will have a secure score. And that's quite useful. What that shows you is how well everything's been configured. So Microsoft has a benchmark of perfect configuration. Excuse me. Sorry. Microsoft has a perfect configuration benchmark, and they assess every organization against it, and they give you a number so you know how well you conform to that. Things like board reports as well. There should be regular commentary in your board reports about your IT risks. And a security dashboard is also hugely helpful. And I'll show you what one of these look like, because I know all these terms can feel a bit amorphous. If you could just stop sharing for 2 seconds, Ollie. Thank you. Just jump in. So here's one I prepared earlier in the famous sort of phrase. And what you can see here is a dashboard that is giving organizations an insight into their security posture. Each of these tabs is a different aspects of an organization's security. So you can see the first one is showing more proactive aspects of it about your vulnerabilities. So if you look down, you can look at your Windows estate and make sure that everything is patched up. Have you got all the right security fixes? Because it's ultimately these risks that hackers exploit. So understanding where they are is critical for planning what work needs to happen. Things like your public identity is useful. Are your staff using their corporate email address to do their Tesco shopping? Why that's important is Tesco's get hacked, and now the hacker has a list of your staff's credentials and potentially login details, because people tend to use similar passwords. So some visibility of what's going on there. Lots of large organizations have been hacked, from LinkedIn, Microsoft to, you name it, many of them have been hacked. And any of your staff that are using their corporate credentials with those organizations, the hackers now have their details. And it tends to be those databases that the hackers are using for their phishing emails. So the more data the hackers have from these exploits, the more phishing emails your staff will get, which raises the chance that one of them will accidentally click on one. Office 365 is now the #1 target for cybercrime. Understanding what's going on about there, what sort of behaviors are we seeing? A classic behavior in Office 365 that a hacker will do very quickly when they gain access to someone's account is forward the emails to an anonymous account, like a Hotmail account. And that way, even though they might not have gained access to the data, they then get a copy effectively of all the emails that are going through that account, waiting to see some exchange about credit card details or paying invoices, so they can intercede and replace that to try and siphon money away. So some of this information, again, should be should be available to you. And monitoring that is absolutely critical, because very often it shows the early indications that someone is trying to get into the organization. And then finally, there's lots of other things about patching levels, antivirus levels, just looking at the configuration. How is your identity services set up? How are your devices set up? Is everything set up the way it should be? There's a lot of data in there, and I appreciate it can be quite overwhelming. There's no way any organization gets everything to perfect. It's a function of risk. So the lower it is, the lower your chance of cyber attack, but you'll never be able to eradicate it, unfortunately. But our view is it's really important to at least understand what the risks are. And from that, you can plan. You don't have to jump on everything straight away, but at least you've got a plan, so you work out what you can remediate. So with all this technology, organizations need to understand their security risks and whether they're secure. The next one, I think, Ollie.
Thanks, Gavin. Just checking I'm sharing the right screen, am I?
No, it's the next one for you.
Next one. Is that right?
That's the one.
Perfect. So onto the legal framework in the UK. So the key point to make here is that there's no single cybersecurity law in the UK. It's instead a patchwork of cybersecurity, privacy, and national security legislation. And I've picked out some of the most significant here. Firstly, the Data Protection Act 2018, which implements the UK GDPR, governing the processing of personal data. So this is the law to look at in a personal data context. So the GDPR impacts how businesses assess, mitigate, and treat cybersecurity risks. And under the security principle, organizations must ensure appropriate security of the personal data, including protection against unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage using appropriate technical or organizational measures. So that is a direct legal duty to put cybersecurity measures in place. Moving on to the Network and Information Systems Regulations 2018. So these focus on the security of IT systems and services which, if disrupted, could potentially cause significant damage to the UK's economy, society, or individual welfare. And I'm going to look at that in a little more detail on the next slide, because we've got some recent reforms coming down the track, which I'll also cover. Next, the Computer Misuse Act 1990. This obviously seems quite old now, but it's still relevant today because it's the legislation which criminalises these various cyber crimes. The Communications Act 2003, as well as applying to TV and radio, the Act also applies to public electronic communications networks, and organisations within scope must put technical measures in place to minimise the impact of security incidents. Plus, there's also a requirement to notify Ofcom in the event of a security breach. So similar to the NIS regs, it's important to understand whether your organisation is within scope, because there's a specific legislative regime that applies if they are in scope. Also, sector-specific rules, regimes, and industry bodies. For example, in the financial services sector, the FCA imposes additional duties, and the FSA has the power to issue significant fines. Other areas of law. So the UK has well-established laws around fraud, trade secrets, confidentiality, and IP infringement, and these are also all relevant in a cybersecurity context. And finally, depending on the context, there may well be international laws which have an extraterritorial effect and which might apply to your organisation or incident. So as you can see, it's very much a patchwork comprised of different areas of law. And it's important to understand which aspects apply to your organisation so that you know what you must comply with. So moving on to the NIS regs in a little more detail. These focus on the security of IT systems. So the aim is to protect the reliability and security of essential services. They apply to two categories: operators of essential services, and these are operators within the specific sectors mentioned, and operators within those sectors that are above the Schedule 2 thresholds. So as you can imagine, the regulations have a Schedule 2 with thresholds, and if you're above those thresholds, then you're caught by the regulations. The second category is relevant digital service providers, and these are providers of online marketplaces, search engines, or cloud services. And similarly, there are thresholds here too. So it's RDSPs with more than 50 employees and a balance sheet exceeding 10 million euros. Also, a requirement to have the head office or nominated representative in the UK. So it's important to consider whether the regulations apply, as they bring in requirements over and above those already mentioned. And interestingly, we've got a couple of updates in this area. So the NIS regulations in the UK derived from the NIS directive in the EU, and there are changes at both the EU and UK level. So in the EU, NIS2 is coming down the tracks, and EU member states must implement the new laws by October next year. And to summarize the changes, more sectors are captured, the thresholds will be lower, so they're really broadening the scope of organisations that will be subject to the new regulations. And there will be a list of basic technical and organisational measures and specific reporting requirements. So obviously, since Brexit, the UK won't be required to implement NIS2, but in parallel, the UK government have undertaken a review of the NIS regulations in the UK and have proposed some amendments which we're expecting to be in force also next year. And to summarise those, more IT companies will be caught. The scope is being expanded to managed services companies. And the regulations give the government flexibility to bring in other sectors, and they also strengthen reporting obligations. So no immediate change, but we're tracking that, and we're expecting changes sometime next year. So moving on from technology that's out there and the complex legal landscape, we're now going to look at what to do in the event of an attack. And it's probably worth mentioning that Charlotte's rushed back in, having encountered a fire alarm in Wood Street, which was probably, hopefully wasn't a malicious act in the office, but yeah. Nice to see you back, Charlotte, and over to you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So you've identified that something has gone wrong. There has been an incident, and the question then, of course, you're going to ask yourself is, how do you find out what has gone wrong and what do you do about it? It's obviously at a time where there's lots of high pressure, there's stress, there's panic, disorder. And so it's really important to have a clear plan in place at the outset so you can follow it step by step and you can escalate matters as needed. The first thing to do is to contact your internal IT team, because you might be able to speak with them, and they might be able to lock down some services and systems to help prevent any further spread of the attack. You do need to obviously check that you're going to be able to do that without breaching any obligations, and you need to do it using a device or an account that ideally hasn't been compromised. And if you think it might have been compromised, then it's just not worth using it, because you don't know quite what else the attackers are going to get access to. So once you've done that and IT have been able to help, they might, for example, be able to change passwords very quickly if you think somebody has infiltrated the server by way of passwords. But you need to make sure you follow up on that problem, because we've actually had an incident in the past where we know a client has contacted their IT team, they've instructed them to change passwords, but unfortunately they didn't follow through and the IT team failed to do that. And so the attack got worse and it spread further. So do make sure you follow up on that.
And it wasn't us, by the way, just checking.
It wasn't you, no. I'm not naming any names. So once you've contacted your internal IT team, you've then got 3 external parties in total that you want to be contacting, and you need to do it in a very specific order, and I'll explain why. The first external party you want to contact is your counsel team, your solicitors, whoever it is you've got on standby. You contact them first so that you can have the best opportunity to attract privilege over your communications, which essentially means that then they can't get out, or they shouldn't be able to be used and used against you, and you can keep them locked down. The counsel team can then assist with the corporate side of things. They can assist with the breach security team, which is Gavin's side, to ensure that all the issues relating to the incident are dealt with, and we can help to do that in a legally compliant way. We can also assist with the communications. We of course need to let personnel and key stakeholders know what's going on. There will inevitably be employment issues, employment law issues to be dealt with, and we can help to report to regulators if need be. The main regulatory body to consider making a report to is the Information Commissioner's Office, particularly if data has been stolen. But there may also be professional regulators as well, and Ollie's just mentioned the FCA. So if you're a regulated financial institution, Principle 11 means that you need to report it to the FCA. So there are other regulators to be considering, and of course you'll know which regulators apply to your business. The second external party to contact are the insurers. Typically, I hope most of you will have cyber or business interruption insurance or some other form of insurance that may well cover you in the event of an attack. And so it's important to contact them once you've got your legal counsel up and running to see what assistance they can provide, and to make sure that everything that is being done doesn't undermine the cover that's being provided. As an aside, it's really important as well just to keep up to date on the insurance landscape in this area. Unsurprisingly, with the amount of cyber attacks that have been going on, particularly since COVID times, insurers are trying to avoid cover where they can if they have an exemption. So for example, there are war exclusion clauses at the moment, which typically mean in the act of war, a cyber attack may not be covered. So do make sure you keep up to date with that, and you make sure you understand your policy and what it covers you for before, hopefully in the inevitable event something doesn't go wrong, but if it does, you know what to do. Third one then, and we have to do this very quickly, remember, you know, this isn't sort of a thing over half a day or whatever, but is to contact your breach response cybersecurity team. You should already know ideally in advance who they're going to be. You would check with your insurers that they're going to cover that if indeed you have insurance. But these are individuals that can then come on board and they can help to identify the nature of the incident. They can monitor the systems for further incidents and breaches, and they can work to try to shut it down and prevent any further migration of the attack. They can also assist with business continuity matters, contingency plans, and monitoring the servers to make sure that the external consequences are minimized as much as possible. And they can also act with legal counsel as a liaison between the potential bad actors and yourself, if indeed you need to negotiate a ransomware or some sort of demand. As I said, though, with the data protection, there's obviously a lot of issues there. And so one of the key things to do once you've got your core team up and running is to communicate both internally and externally to ensure that if indeed any data has been stolen, that the rights of those data subjects are protected, and that any other rights, duties and obligations are met in a legally compliant way to minimize any damage. So the first thing to consider if we're talking about stolen data will be to consider involving whether the threshold under the Data Protection Act has been met to notify the data subjects of this incident. The test is whether the breach is likely to result in high risk to the rights and freedoms of the data subject. So it's quite an onerous test, but if indeed it looks as though that we are likely to be in breach of that, we need to consider that very carefully and make sure we're notifying the data subjects as quickly as possible in a legally compliant way. We also need to then consider your contracts. So for example, you may have certain arrangements set in place with your contractors, but in fact, they may then have onward obligations to report if indeed their data has been stolen. So you need to consider that. And again, that's sort of liaising very carefully with your third parties to make sure we're aware of what's going on. And then finally, if the incident involves any disclosures on the dark web, which typically is the threat to try to obtain a ransom demand payment, reputational damage, of course, needs to be very carefully considered. And it's preferable for the party that's suffering the incident, so the victim, to inform the stakeholders of that rather than them learn of it in the other way around as and when the press, for example, get hold of it. So there's a lot to manage there, and it has to happen very quickly. So as I said at the outset, I think it's really good to get a plan in place so you know in the hopefully unlikely event, but in the event of an attack, you know who to contact, in which order, and who's going to do that and who has responsibility for it. So I just want to move on, hopefully, there we go, to the next slide, to talk very briefly about ransomware. Just to give one example of cyber attacks and quite how catastrophic they can be, I still find the attack I want to talk about very briefly took place back in October 2020, so it's quite old, but the figures are still quite staggering, I think, when you look at it. Hackney Council suffered a cyber attack, as I say, October 2020, and it ended up costing the council £12.2 million in that financial year. Of that 12.2 million, that included £444,000 spent on IT consultancy, 152,000 on the recovery of its system that was used for social care data, and nearly 600,000 to recover the housing register. And that doesn't even take into account the cost of any lost time, the increased insurance premiums, or anything like that. So that shows just how large these attacks can be and how catastrophic they can be to a business. But ransomware, as most of you will know, is a demand for a ransom payment, and that typically is said to be needed in exchange for the safe return of stolen data or information, or to unlock the system so you can get back in and continue with business. And as I've said there on the slide, it actually increasingly poses a double threat. And the reason why it's a double threat is because first, the bad actors now typically exfiltrate the data from the network before it's encrypted, which then will stunt or stall your business and create a minefield of issues to navigate. But second, the bad actor then uses the threat of publishing that data as a negotiation tactic to obtain payment of a higher ransom sum. So it's something to be really mindful of, and ideally have a plan in place as and when, if somebody is demanding ransom payment. Because it of course culminates in this increased pressure on the organisation, who may initially refuse to make the payment, or the insurers may well refuse to make a payment if you're on cover. But ultimately, of course, if what you want to do is get your data back and carry on with business. So it's a real sort of tipping point for many companies. There are things that can be done, though, if a demand is made to mitigate the situation. So, for example, experts are able to trace cryptocurrency. So you can try to track its location if indeed the demand is a payment of crypto, which inevitably it typically is. And so you can then try to find the cryptocurrency that has been paid to seek its safe retrieval, or if not, to identify where the bad actors are to pursue them. So there are ways in which you can track it. And again, you have to do that before you actually make the payment. So it's key to get the experts on board from the outset to help do that. And insurers are increasingly aware of this, and they often seek the specialist advice at the outset themselves to make sure they could try to recover the payment that's been made. So one example of this is a case in 2019 called AA and Persons Unknown. That was where a Canadian insurance company was hacked, and it suffered from a cyber attack, which prevented them from accessing their IT systems. They'd been encrypted with malware. Their insurer was actually an English insurer, which is why it's an English court case, paid the ransom demand. The hackers demanded that the company transfer nearly 100, I think it was just over 109 Bitcoins, which at the time was the equivalent of just under it was $950,000. And the payment had to be made to a specified account in exchange for the decryption software. So really typical type of ransom demand for these cyber attacks. The insurer paid the ransom, but they had hired consultants who then tracked the Bitcoin payment to a specified address linked to the cryptocurrency exchange. Some of the Bitcoin had already been dissipated from that wallet when they had tracked it down, but 96 of the 109 coins remained in the account. And so the insurer sought a proprietary injunction over the Bitcoins in the wallet, which then stopped them from being further dissipated and meant ultimately they could recover them. So there are ways in which we can try to work to recover a ransom demand after it's been paid. But of course, ideally, it doesn't have to be paid in the first place if possible. It's important to note, in England, at least in England and Wales, the payment of a ransom demand in and of itself is not illegal. It is in other jurisdictions, but in the UK it's not. But there are other sanctions and laws that need to be considered before a payment is made. Unfortunately, it's not quite as straightforward as it can be paid, and that's it. So looking at those briefly, bear with me. So as I say, once you make a payment, there are potential criminal issues that can arise, particularly if the payment has been made in cryptocurrency. And there are laws to be considering, such as we say on the slides, money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions, and data protection. The first thing I think to note is, as I said, making a ransom demand is a criminal offence. So paying it isn't a criminal offence, but making a demand itself is, unsurprising to most of us, sure, a criminal offence, and it constitutes blackmail under the Theft Act 1968. That's because it's an unwarranted demand with menaces. But a frequently asked question, though, is whether a payment of a ransom demand gives rise to criminal liability of the payer, of yourselves. And the short answer, as I said, is it's not a criminal offence, but there are very different specifics that need to be considered in that. Payment of a ransom demand could give liability under some of the broadly drafted provisions of the Proceeds of Crime Act. So, for example, it could be caught by concealing, disguising, converting, transferring, or removing from the jurisdiction criminal property. And there are other sections as well, such as if you're acquiring or having the use and possession of criminal property. So we do need to bear that one in mind. Similarly, if a party who receives crypto assets, for example, following receipt of a ransom demand is subject to sanctions, that would likely cause the person who's transferred it to incur criminal liability, because the sanctions regime in England and Wales is quite specific about that, and something that needs to be considered very carefully, as does OFAC and other sanction regimes. Legally obtaining or otherwise preparing crypto assets to meet a ransom demand does not, at the stage before they're transferred, cause those crypto assets to become criminal property within the meaning of the Proceeds of Crime Act. And so taking that action does not actually constitute the commission of an offence, which is good. But those crypto assets are then likely to become criminal property once they're transferred to, or they fall into the hands of the bad actors. And so we need to then consider whether actually dealing with them then would give rise to potential liabilities. Similarly, the meeting of a ransom demand can also give rise under the Terrorism Act 2000, and that's if the payees are or are suspected to be terrorists. And so liability can arise under that for terrorism funding, or entering into or becoming concerned with an arrangement as a result of which the money is available to essentially a suspected terrorist. So again, we need to carefully consider that. And something we've sadly seen in cases before is that the initial chaos of responding to an incident actually leads to further breaches being caused. And so we need to be careful as to the onward steps that we're making when we're dealing with these incidents. So, for example, liability could arise when the data is disclosed without somebody's consent in a bid to try to remediate the damage caused by an incident. Most of those cases, hopefully, liability is only limited to a civil nature and it's not criminal, but in certain cases, criminal liabilities could also be incurred. So, for example, if you are knowingly or recklessly making a false statement in response to an information notice, or more pertinently, if you're knowing or recklessly obtaining or disclosing personal data. So again, some bits there just to be carefully considering, I think, during this process. So that all sounds quite scary, I fully accept, and hearing about particularly the criminal liabilities is far from ideal and something to make sure that we are aware of at all times. But there are ways, as I said, in which we can try to remediate this after the attack. So, I mean, the questions here that I've just put up, firstly, can you trace the ransom payment made? As I said, a lot of the demands are made in cryptocurrency. And the beauty of cryptocurrency is that every transaction is recorded on the blockchain. And if typically it's on a public blockchain, it means anybody in the world can go online and find where what has happened to that wallet. And so you are able to trace the cryptocurrency that has been paid by way of a ransom demand. And as I said, there are cases now where you can seek a proprietary injunction to seek the safe recovery of. So that's one option. The second option is to pursue the bad actors themselves. It's not always simple, but there are ways and means in which you can seek to identify the identity of that bad actor. And in fact, in the English courts, you can actually pursue persons unknown, or in the States, I think it's Joe Bloggs. If you don't know who they are, but you know, for example, where the wallet is, and you then work to find information via the courts to identify them. So there are ways in which you can go after them themselves to try to remediate and recover any damages that you've incurred from the cyber attack. And then finally, again, this is one of these sort of tricky topics, but actually a company can pursue its directors if they fail to comply with their duties to the company. So for example, if a director has failed to consider whether stricter cyber regimes were required, or whether perhaps their employees needed further training, those directors can be held liable. And so if a company has suffered loss, it can look to its directors to help remediate that situation as well, if need be. And equally, the company may be able to pursue any other previous cybersecurity advisors if their advice failed and was negligent, for example. There are other actors and other parties you might be able to recover some damages from to help remediate the situation afterwards. That being said, though, of course, prevention is better than cure. So, you know, let's now look at, I think, next steps and what we can do to try to avoid a cyber attack from occurring.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. So from a technical point of view, obviously I've covered some of the preventative solutions that you can put in place. But really, if you do nothing else, first of all, we'd recommend get an understanding of your current risks. So put in place the right sort of audits, assess your technology. Obviously, if you don't know what your risks are, it's very difficult to plan what you do next. Build an appropriate incident management team. You know, when a cyber attack occurs, it's quite a high stress situation. You want to put the thinking in place before that occurs, because trying to do things in a hurry tends to mean mistakes are made. So work out who are going to be those individuals that respond. They might be partly your own staff, partly your outsourcers' staff. Understanding what that body of people are means that should something occur, you can immediately respond to that and ensure that you've got the right team on it straight away. Obviously, ongoing testing. The problem with security is whatever you do today, things change over time, and they're changing quickly. So within months, you'll have more vulnerabilities, there'll be more issues within the estate. So the only way to stay on top of it is just continued testing and training. You know, unfortunately, users tend to be one of the main entry points for most cyber attacks. So it's vital that your colleagues fully appreciate the risks. You know, I know nowadays everyone's so busy, putting them on long training courses, you know, is sometimes difficult. But there's other ways that you can train staff. You know, benign phishing tests, where you effectively are sending a phishing email to staff to measure how many people actually click on it. It's quite a low tech solution, but that additional visibility helps you be a bit more focused with your training. Unfortunately, in the sort of benign phishing tests we've done, it tends to be the more senior staff that actually will end up clicking on the link. And they're the people that have generally more access to sensitive information. So things like that, continual training programs helps keep you secure.
Thanks, Gavin. And continuing with the preventative measures theme, we've listed out from a legal governance and contractual perspective some other steps to think about here. So insurance, it's important to review your current insurance coverage and assess whether it's likely to respond. If it's not, consider specific cyber insurance. So we are seeing an increasing trend in organisations going for standalone cyber insurance, although it's reportedly becoming more sought after and expensive, but it's definitely something to consider. On the contract side, contract and policy reviews, review contracts and policies, make amendments to mitigate risks, consider due diligence on your suppliers when onboarding them. You know, you could be looking for accreditation. There are various accreditation schemes out there. For example, you could require contractually that all of your suppliers are certified with ISO 27001. And moving on to your supply chain, generally, it is important to understand what measures key suppliers have taken, because vulnerabilities can often be identified in the supply chain. What contractual obligations do you have against them, and what rights if there is a cyber incident? And there are, of course, specific concerns around personal data and data protection laws. And on this, it's important to understand data flows and hosting arrangements. And on the regulatory side, understand your regulatory obligations and be ready to report an attack within the required timescales. So plenty of preventative measures to consider at this stage. And onto some final key takeaways from us. Hopefully we've shown that cyber attacks are a real threat, and a threat that is increasing. They are likely, they are costly, so be prepared. It's better to adopt best practice processes in order to be able to respond properly in the event of an attack. It's important to assess your current security posture and IT risks. As we've all said, prevention is better than cure. So what preventative steps can you take now? And finally, as I explained, the legal landscape is a patchwork. So it's important to understand that and understand the current legal landscape, and also get ready for the changes which are coming down the track to ensure compliance going forward. And finally, to mention from me, as part of the collaboration between PMC and WaveX, we'll soon be launching our new online cybersecurity audit tool. So the aim of this is to enable organizations to assess cyber resilience and identify any vulnerabilities. It'll provide instant scores and feedback across a range of key areas, and will allow you to track progress and benchmark performance. It'll be free to access. We're just finalizing that now, and it should hopefully be launched next month. And then I think we've maybe got a few minutes left. I don't know, Charlotte, Gavin, any questions popped up that you want to pick up on?
The one question that we had was asked of us, I think it was while I was talking. I was trying to work out quite what I was saying at the time it was asked, so excuse me if I've misinterpreted it, but when I was giving examples, I think of how you can seek to recover damages and compensation for potential cyber attacks. The question was firstly noting that it is interesting, good to be aware of, and asking whether we've seen any action taken on those points and how those liabilities manifest themselves in practice. And the answer is yes, we have, we and others have acted in that way in order to trace cryptocurrency, to seek the recovery of it, to pursue bad actors, to try to locate their identity and recover that, recover damages from them. So in short, yes, we have seen it, it does happen. And in fact, directors are also pursued as well by companies if they fall in foul of their duties. Great.
And one that's just come in, probably for Gavin, where should we start with all of this?
As I said, excuse me, very much assessing where you are at the moment. Obviously, the survey that the tool that's going to be going out next month will really help you get a sense of that. But there's some relatively inexpensive solutions that you can run across your network, like an audit, just to understand what's there at the moment. And as I said, many of you will already have things like Secure Score. So ask your IT provider, ask your IT department, what's your current Secure Score, and just start the conversation about how that can be improved. So it doesn't have to, I think lots of people when it comes to security, they're worried that it's going to be really expensive. And the problem is the whole area of security is quite amorphous. So no matter what you spend, you're always left with the doubt, well, am I now secure? Is there more I need to spend money on? So I'd always recommend just get an understanding of what you have at the moment. Where are your risks? And from then you can work out a proportional response to that.
Right, and it's similar on my side, looking at your supply chain, who are your key suppliers? What steps are they taking? Where are the vulnerabilities? What policies, procedures have you got in place? What can you adopt and training? So yeah, it's a case of on the technical and the contractual, understanding where you are and building from there.
Doesn't look like there's any other questions. Obviously, we've done a great job of explaining ourselves then.
Absolutely. Well, all that remains for me to do then is to thank Charlotte and Gavin for participating today and for sharing insights, and particularly thank you to Charlotte for rushing back in after fire alarm in our London office, but keeps us all on our toes. So thank you to you guys, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Thanks, Ollie.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.